The candlelight flickered against the frosted windows of the house on Shipley Street in Wilmington, Delaware. Outside, the December wind of 1845 howled through the bare branches, but inside, Catherine Coffin was setting an extra place at the dining room table. Her movements were deliberate, precise, each plate placed with intention, each fork positioned with care. She had no way of knowing that this simple act, this gesture of basic human dignity, would soon unleash the full fury of the United States government against her family. What happened next in that modest Quaker home would challenge everything America claimed to believe about freedom, justice, and human worth. Because when hungry, desperate people knocked on Catherine Coffin's door that winter night, she did something that the law considered more dangerous than murder, more threatening than treason. She invited them to sit at her table as equals. The year 1850 marked a turning point in America's relationship with its own soul. The Fugitive Slave Act had just passed, transforming every dinner invitation, every shared meal, every act of basic hospitality into a potential federal crime. Under this new law, anyone providing food or shelter to an escaped enslaved person faced 6 months in prison and a crushing $1,000 fine, equivalent to nearly $40,000 today. But Catherine Coffin had been setting extra places at her table for years. She and her husband Levi had transformed their Indiana home into what would become known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. Over 2 decades, more than 3,000 desperate souls would find refuge in their house. Yet it wasn't the hidden compartments or secret passages that made the Coffin home revolutionary. It was something far more dangerous. It was the dining room. Because in that dining room, something happened that challenged the very foundation of American society. Fugitive enslaved people didn't just receive food from the Coffins. They sat at the family table. They used proper china and silverware. They engaged in conversation. They were treated as guests, as human beings, as equals. In an America where black and white people eating together violated every social convention, where such encounters were so taboo they required no written prohibition because they were unthinkable, the Coffin dining room became a space of radical equality, and the government would make them pay dearly for it. The story begins in New Garden, North Carolina, where young Levi Coffin first encountered the brutal reality of slavery. At age 7, he witnessed something that would haunt him forever: a coffle of enslaved people, chained together in pairs, being driven to auction. The memory burned into his consciousness: the shuffle of bare feet, the clank of iron shackles, the defeated posture of human beings treated as livestock. But it was during corn husking season that Levi's true education began. While other white youths dined inside the main house, young Levi would slip away to the woods where enslaved workers gathered. His sack of corn often contained more than grain bacon, cornbread, whatever scraps he could smuggle from the family kitchen. In those shadowy thickets, he would sit with desperate people and listen to their stories. They spoke in voices raw with exhaustion and hope. Stories of masters who used the lash like punctuation in their daily conversations. Tales of families torn apart and sold like cattle. But also stories of dreams. Dreams of a place where children could learn to read, where families could stay together, where a person's worth wasn't measured by the color of their skin. These moments in the North Carolina woods taught Levi something his Quaker upbringing had only hinted at. The enslaved weren't the happy, childlike beings described in Southern propaganda. They were complex, intelligent, suffering human beings whose dreams and fears mirrored his own. When he shared his meager food with them, he wasn't performing charity. He was recognizing their fundamental humanity. By 1819, the pressure had become unbearable. North Carolina's black laws were tightening like a noose around anyone who dared help enslaved people. Quaker families faced constant harassment, surveillance, and violence. The Coffins made the agonizing decision to abandon everything they had built and flee north to Indiana, carrying with them a conviction that would soon transform American history. Newport, Indiana, seemed like a haven, a free state where the Coffins could practice their beliefs without persecution. But Levi quickly discovered that even in the North, freedom was an illusion for those fleeing slavery. The town was home to a large community of free blacks, but their hiding places were well known to slave catchers who prowled the area like wolves. It was during the winter of 1826-27 that the Coffins took their first desperate guests into their home. Catherine later recalled that night with perfect clarity. The knock came just after midnight, soft, hesitant, the sound of people who expected rejection but had nowhere else to turn. When she opened the door, she found a woman and 2 children, their clothing frozen stiff, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. Catherine didn't just offer them shelter in the barn or cellar. She brought them into the main house, into the warmth of the kitchen, and did something extraordinary. She began preparing a proper meal. Hot soup, fresh bread, milk that was still warm from their cow. And then, as the food finished cooking, she set places at the family dining table. The woman stared at the formal place setting as if it were some elaborate trap. Enslaved people didn't eat from china plates. They didn't use proper silverware. On plantations, they were often fed from troughs like animals, given only cornmeal and scraps. The sight of a real dinner table, set with care and respect, was almost incomprehensible. But Catherine's voice was firm and kind. "Please sit," she said simply. "You're guests in our home." What followed was a meal unlike any the fugitives had ever experienced. They sat in actual chairs, at a real table, using forks and knives like human beings. The coffin children treated them as ordinary dinner guests, asking about their journey, sharing stories about their own lives. For perhaps the first time in their lives, these fleeing souls were experiencing something revolutionary, the radical recognition of their own humanity. Word of the coffin's hospitality spread through the mysterious networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. Unlike other underground railroad stations that focused on hiding people in barns or basements, the coffin home offered something far more dangerous: dignity. Fugitives didn't just find shelter there. They found affirmation that they were human beings worthy of respect. Catherine organized what appeared to be an innocent sewing circle among her Quaker neighbors. The women would gather weekly at the coffin house, their needles flying as they gossiped and shared local news. But these meetings were far from ordinary social gatherings. The women were creating complete wardrobes for fugitive slaves, not just mending travel clothes, but crafting entire new identities. Formal dresses that would allow women to travel as free domestics, suits that would transform men into respectable businessmen, disguises that could mean the difference between freedom and death. More importantly, Catherine was organizing a supply chain of compassion. Every week, food would arrive at the coffin home officially for their large family and business guests, but actually destined for the dining room table, where desperate people would experience their first taste of human dignity. Levi later wrote that they rarely passed a week without hearing that telltale midnight knock. Sometimes it was a single mother, with children clinging to her skirts. Sometimes it was an elderly couple who had spent decades dreaming of freedom. Sometimes it was young men whose backs bore the scars of countless whippings. Each time, Catherine would set extra places at the table. The ritual never varied. Guests were welcomed into the main house, never hidden away like shameful secrets. They were offered baths, clean clothes, and real beds with actual linens. But most importantly, they were invited to join the family for meals. The coffin children grew up understanding that their dinner table was a place where all of God's children were welcome. These weren't quick meals eaten in secret. They were full family dinners where fugitives could rest, share their stories, and remember what it felt like to be treated as human beings. Frederick Douglass, who would later receive help from Quaker families after being attacked by an anti-abolition mob, described the psychological impact of such treatment. For people who had been viewed as property their entire lives, sitting at a family table represented a fundamental shift in how they saw themselves. But these moments of grace were occurring within a context of mortal danger. Every shared meal was an act of defiance that could result in imprisonment, financial ruin, or death. The mathematics were stark. One person's act of compassion against the full power of the United States government. The government's response was swift and merciless. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 created a legal framework designed to criminalize basic human compassion. Federal marshals received financial incentives to capture suspected fugitives, $10 for each person returned to slavery, only $5 for those released. The system brazenly prohibited the use of habeas corpus and denied alleged fugitives the right to testify in their own defense. Thomas Garrett, the Quaker merchant whose Delaware home served as the last station before Philadelphia, lived under constant surveillance. His house on Shipley Street was watched around the clock by federal agents and bounty hunters. A $10,000 reward equivalent to nearly $400,000 today was placed on his head, yet Garrett continued inviting fugitives not just into his home, but to his dinner table. The surveillance was comprehensive and terrifying. Government agents infiltrated Quaker communities, posing as sympathetic neighbors while gathering intelligence on Underground Railroad activities. Children grew up understanding that sharing a meal with a black person could result in their parents' imprisonment and their family's financial destruction. The psychological burden created lasting trauma for children, who witnessed both the humanity of their fugitive guests and the savage response of authorities. When the Hawkins family, Samuel, a free man, his enslaved wife, Emmeline, and their 6 children sought refuge with Thomas Garrett in December 1845, they triggered a legal confrontation that would expose the government's true intentions. The family was captured while hiding at John Hunn's Underground Railroad station and taken to the Newcastle County Jail. What followed was a show trial designed to terrorize anyone who might consider offering hospitality to fugitive slaves. Chief Justice Roger Taney, the same man who would later deliver the infamous Dred Scott decision, presided over proceedings specifically designed to be punitive examples. The massive fines imposed on Garrett and Hunn swept away their life savings and left them facing bankruptcy. Yet when the sheriff finished auctioning off Garrett's possessions to pay the court-imposed penalties, the old Quaker's response became legendary. Asked if he would cease his Underground Railroad activities, Garrett declared in open court, "If anyone knows a fugitive who needs assistance, send him to Thomas Garrett, and he will befriend him." The violence that surrounded these dinner encounters was systematic and horrifying. The Margaret Garner case of 1856 reveals the deadly stakes involved. When Kentucky slave catchers and federal marshals stormed the Cincinnati home where the Garner family was sheltering, Margaret Garner used a knife found in the kitchen and slit the throat of her 2-year-old daughter rather than see her return to slavery. Court records describe how Garner's other children, in tattered clothing, tugged at her arm while witnessing extreme violence during the raid. Children were not spared the trauma. In an 1834 raid in Salem, New Jersey, a posse invaded a cabin in the middle of the night and forced 9 African Americans, including 5 children, into wagons. When officers questioned the boys about their wounds, they said the folks threw them down and tried to kill them. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic campaign of terror designed to make every act of hospitality a potential death sentence. Quaker children grew up with the constant awareness that their parents' kindness could destroy their families. The psychological burden was enormous, watching beloved dinner guests disappear into the night, knowing that discovery could mean torture or death for everyone involved. Yet the encounters continued. In farmhouses across Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Indiana, Quaker families maintained their dangerous practice of setting extra places at their tables. The Longwood farm of the Cox family became known for treating freedom seekers as family members rather than hidden refugees. These weren't charity meals served in secret corners, but genuine family dining experiences where fugitives ate as honored guests. The contrast was revolutionary for people who had never been treated as fully human during a meal. Research reveals that enslaved children often ate from troughs, like pigs, given only cornmeal and scraps. The dignity of proper utensils, furniture, and family conversation was profoundly healing for people who had been treated as livestock their entire lives. Vivian Carter Mason, former president of the National Council of Negro Women, who knew Harriet Tubman personally, recalled shared meals with steaming bowls of soup and crisp cornbread piled high after Tubman told hair-raising stories of escape and rescue. These weren't hurried, fearful encounters, but genuine moments of human connection. Some families developed ongoing relationships that lasted far beyond the initial escape. William Still's meticulous records from the Philadelphia Underground Railroad station show Quakers maintaining connections with formerly enslaved people, helping with job placement and family reunification. Evidence indicates some formerly enslaved people returned to visit families who had helped them, suggesting genuine bonds formed during these vulnerable moments. The emotional landscape was complex and fraught with hypervigilance. Fugitives maintained constant awareness that discovery meant death or torture, yet they also experienced something they had never known before, the recognition of their fundamental human worth. The Quaker testimony of equality, seeing that of God in everyone, meant fugitives experienced a spiritual transformation from being viewed as property to being recognized as children of God. But this healing occurred within a context of mortal terror. Every dinner invitation carried the knowledge that federal agents could burst through the door at any moment. Every shared meal was shadowed by the understanding that capture meant not just return to slavery, but brutal punishment designed to discourage future escape attempts. Catherine Coffin understood these stakes better than most. During their 20 years in Newport, Indiana, she had given birth to 5 more children while maintaining their dangerous dinner table ministry. There was always a baby or toddler to care for, in addition to numerous house guests whose lives depended on the family's silence and courage. Levi later recalled at their 50th wedding anniversary party, "There never was a night too cold or dark or rainy for her to get up at any hour and prepare a meal for the poor fugitives. Catherine's sewing circle had evolved into what was essentially an underground railroad depot, with agents assessing clothing needs and sizes, then choosing garments from their secret storehouse. When they moved to Cincinnati in 1847, the Coffins continued their dangerous hospitality. Their new home, with its many boarding rooms and constant stream of guests, provided perfect cover for Underground Railroad activities. Fugitives would be dressed as butlers, cooks, and other workers in uniforms that Catherine had created, allowing them to hide in plain sight while sharing meals with the family. The systematic nature of this resistance was extraordinary. Far from isolated acts of individual conscience, these dinner table encounters were part of an interconnected network that spanned multiple states and operated for over 4 decades. Quaker families from North Carolina to Vermont created an intricate system of communication and support, connected by kinship ties, religious meetings, and shared moral conviction. The Cox family's Longwood Farm, the Garrett House on Shipley Street, the Coffin homes in both Indiana and Ohio, dozens of other Quaker households, where the simple act of setting a place at the dinner table became one of the most subversive gestures in 19th century America. Academic historians have worked to separate myth from reality in Underground Railroad narratives, revealing that the actual scale was far more limited than popular stories suggest. Scholarly estimates indicate only 40,000 to 100,000 people escaped via the Underground Railroad out of nearly 4 million enslaved people. Most fugitives who made it to the North still face recapture, and most escape attempts ended in brutal punishment. Yet within these constraints, the documented dinner table encounters represent something profound and historically significant. They weren't romanticized legends, but systematic community resistance rooted in religious conviction. Thousands of fugitives experienced genuine family hospitality from interconnected networks of Quaker families who coordinated their efforts across state lines. The government understood exactly how dangerous these dinner encounters truly were. The brutal response, constitutional violations, massive surveillance, economic warfare, demonstrates how threatened the system felt by simple acts of human recognition. When ordinary families chose to treat Black people as fully human in a society built on denying that humanity, they were committing revolutionary acts that challenged the fundamental structures of American power. The legacy of these dangerous dinner tables extends far beyond the Underground Railroad period. The surveillance techniques developed to monitor Quaker households influenced modern law enforcement. The legal frameworks created to criminalize hospitality established precedents that would echo through American jurisprudence for generations. More importantly, these families understood something we sometimes forget: that recognizing someone's full humanity, inviting them to sit as an equal at your table, can be the most subversive act of all. In a society built on racial hierarchy, the simple gesture of sharing a meal as equals became a form of resistance that the government considered so dangerous, it deployed unprecedented punishment to stop it. The Coffins, Garrett, and dozens of other Quaker families paid an enormous price for their convictions. Financial ruin, social ostracism, constant surveillance, the ever-present threat of violence. Yet they continued setting extra places at their tables, continued recognizing the fundamental humanity of people their government classified as property. Their legacy lives not in sanitized stories of heroic rescue, but in the documented reality of moral courage that came at devastating personal cost. They created moments of sacred recognition within a system designed to deny that sacredness existed. They proved that even in America's darkest chapter, ordinary families could choose love over law, humanity over hierarchy, compassion over compliance. And in doing so, they changed not just the lives of the people they helped, but the very definition of what it means to be truly free. Today, we remember their courage not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Not because they were heroes, but because they were human beings who chose to see the humanity in others when their government demanded they see only property. Their dinner tables became altars of human dignity, their shared meals a communion of equals in a nation built on inequality. The next time you set a place at your table, remember Catherine Coffin. Remember Thomas Garrett. Remember all the families who understood that the most dangerous thing they could do in 1850 America was also the most human. Treat a hungry person as worthy of dignity, respect, and love. Because in the end, that's what these dinner table encounters were really about. Not politics or law or ideology, but the simple recognition that every person deserves to eat their meals with dignity, to be treated as fully human, to sit at the table of American promise not as a beggar, but as an equal. That recognition was so dangerous, it nearly brought down a government. and so powerful it helped birth a nation where such recognition might one day be possible for everyone. The candles have long since burned out in those Quaker dining rooms. The plates have been cleared, the chairs pushed back, the guests departed into history. But the echo of their courage remains, reminding us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply setting an extra place at your table and saying, "Please sit, you're welcome here." In a world that still struggles with questions of who belongs, who deserves dignity, and who merits a place at the table of human fellowship, the legacy of those dangerous Quaker dinners burns brighter than ever. Because they proved that love, expressed through the simple act of shared meals, can indeed be stronger than law, more powerful than government, and more enduring than the systems built to divide us. The table is still set. The invitation still stands. The question that remains is this: who will we invite to sit with us, and what price are we willing to pay for recognizing their fundamental human worth? History is watching and waiting for our answer.